This is Shannon with Stack of Stones, and today we are going to talk a little bit about compassion fatigue. And if you're a guardian, I think that compassion fatigue is one of the biggest concerns I have when it comes to your mental health and wellness. So let me back up. Again, I'm Shannon. The company I run is called Stack of Stones, and we use this word guardian to wrap together anyone who's in a helping role. So this could be anyone from first responders to healthcare to social services. But at the end of the day, if your job is to help somebody who's experiencing distress, I use the word guardian just to kind of wrap everybody together under one short word. And compassion fatigue in particular is a really big deal for guardians because of that element of distress. So if the person in front of you that you are working to assist is experiencing, maybe they're in pain, maybe they're afraid, they're angry, they're sad, right? All these different things that you deal with every day, there's a very good chance they're not necessarily on their best behavior, right? When we're hurting or angry or scared, we tend to be a little bit more unpleasant, right? And so that means that not only are you needing to provide care and compassion, but it's oftentimes to someone who's not really great to deal with, and you're trying to be extra kind to them because you know that they're having a rather rough day, okay? And that's why for guardians, I think compassion fatigue is a really big deal. And I actually call compassion fatigue the death of 1,000 paper cuts. A lot of times if there's one really big, gnarly, critical incident or something like that, and you're having specific nightmares about it, you know what's wrong. Compassion fatigue is a bit more vague. I'll explain. I have brought with me a giant jar of beans, okay? And I want you to think about yourself as a giant jar of beans. So when you first began your career, right, you got out of academy or school or whatever you needed, you were all shiny and fresh and new and ready to serve your community, you were a big-ass jar of beans. You were full of compassion and empathy and a desire to serve, okay? And you start working and it's great, but over time, you're using up your beans. Let me give you some examples of how different scenarios use different levels of beans, okay? So we're going to use the example of a paramedic. Let's say you're a paramedic and the call you are about to run is an elderly woman who is experiencing chest pain, okay? Fair enough. Let's say you roll in. She is indeed experiencing some sort of cardiac distress, and she's so kind and grateful that you're there. She calls you sweetheart. She's not super critical, so you are able to meet her needs, get her to the hospital. And as a bonus, she weighs 96 pounds, so you just pop her on in, okay? Super easy call, right? A couple things make this pretty minor when it comes to using up your beans. One, you can solve the problem. So my guess is in whatever role you are doing, when you can't solve the problem and you can't help the way you want, that uses more beans. And this one, just a couple, because you can solve the problem. Secondly, she's nice. The situation is pleasant. This is not really a high bean situation. You are still using compassion and empathy, so every situation uses some beans, but that's like 7, okay? However, let's imagine for a second that the patient is kind and sweet and you can solve the cardiac situation, but her family is not. Maybe they're kind of the bulldog types who are in your ear asking why you're not moving faster, asking if you're going to save her life. They're really probably afraid, right? This is going back to that idea that if they're in distress, they may be really in your face. That's going to use a lot more beans, okay? That family uses a lot more beans. Or maybe little lady experiencing cardiac distress is small and you can't solve the problem, but she's, like moderately racist. And especially if you're a person of color, she's making some little barbs at you. That uses beans, right? It is inappropriate. It's not like you're going to call her out in the middle of her heart attack, right? So you're using patience and professionalism, and you're just using up them beans, okay? Or something else in the scenario that could use beans is if you can't save her, right? Let's imagine this is a pretty major situation, and maybe you can't get her there in time, you lose her. So then you've got family members experiencing heightened levels of distress. You are experiencing a much higher level of energy and output in order to try to make the save, and that's going to use a lot more beans, okay? So this is just one scenario, and I want you to think as you go through your workday, how many beans did that use, okay? Now, we're all different, so I can't tell you exactly what are going to be your big bean users, okay? We all have kind of different life stories, different trigger points that make us more susceptible. So if your coworkers are really impacted by something and you're not, or vice versa, that's okay. It doesn't mean there's something wrong with you. It just means we're different. In general, I'll give you a couple of general situations that will probably use quite a few beans for you. The biggest one impacting so many of my guardians is frequent flyers, right? Over and over and over. The same thing over and over again. So there's a couple things in particular about that use up our beans. First is one, there's just the repetition, right? If you have small children and you've answered the same question 25 times, the first time wasn't that bad, right? 22nd time was a lot worse. Same with frequent flyers. The repetition makes it so that we have to use more patience and kindness. Our faces get a little more frozen. But even more than that, the repetition is often coming from a situation that can't really be solved, right? So if this frequent flyer is the same schizophrenic, drug-addicted, homeless person that you have run up on several times in the last week, you know there's not much you can do, right? Or we can't do a hold, we can't necessarily take them to jail, like we're just going to tell them to stop yelling at passerbys and tell them we'll see them tomorrow, right? That, in general, guardians have a desire to help. That's why you got into this work. And if you can't help, that really uses our beans, okay? So I want you to think about situations where you can't help. There's also a high level of bean use when someone's very entitled and demanding, right? So they're rude to you. Anyone who says, I pay your salary, right? Beans. And then we're all kind of different. So some of us may use up more beans if we're dealing with children, the elderly, it may be a certain type of call or situation. Whatever it is, I want you to start to think about what uses up my beans. Okay, and here's what makes compassion fatigue so tricky. Let's imagine you've made it through your shift, good job, you've spread beans here and there all across the city, doing a good job to take care of your fellow citizens, but it has been emotionally expensive for you, right? So providing patience and compassion and kindness throughout the course of a day is emotionally expensive. And what often happens is it's time to go home, you don't have a lot of beans left, right? The jar is looking pretty empty. You're exhausted, you're depleted, you don't want to make any more decisions, you don't want to be a patient listener. You have used all those beans up. But your family members still deserve to have you come home as a whole, healthy human being. And this is what gets really hard, right? So if your spouse is having a really hard day, maybe your kids are melting down because you used the wrong sippy cup, maybe your mom broke her computer again, or your friend is in the middle of a divorce. There's all these things that are a part of life. I'm going to assume that you care about the people in your life, and so you want to connect to them, but you are super low on beans. You're just struggling. The reason I want to tell you about this is one, that's real. So you're not just an asshole, right? You're low on beans. That's true and that's real. But it's also not sustainable, okay? So the thing with compassion fatigue is it's going to impact all of us if we're doing this guardian work, and we can take steps to counterbalance it. We can't prevent it, right? No matter what, you're going to have to spend the beans. Instead, it's figuring out how to put more beans back in the other jar. This training is not going to go into those methods. I have other trainings on resilience routines for that, but just know that it takes effort, okay? We have to put the beans back in the jar, make you feel like a whole, healthy human once again. Because here is the thing. Over time, as you go along your career, your bean jar shrinks, okay? We just have fewer beans to give, right? If you've been doing the job for a while, you know you may not be as kind and compassionate as you once were. You may feel a little bit more disconnected, cynical, calloused. And that's not a failure. That's just the result of the work shrinks your bean jar, to be technical about it. Okay, so you start a shift, you have fewer beans to give, which also means you're likely going to get home with very few beans. And the reason I worry so much about compassion fatigue is our relationships start to fall apart. And our relationships are one of the key ways we replenish our bean jar, right? The people who love and support and know us is one of the key ways we rebuild that humanity. And if our relationships are falling apart because we're coming home so low on beans, then we're in trouble. And what can then happen, you turn into one of these, right? So can everyone think of someone at work that is a tiny bean jar? Maybe you're the tiny bean jar, right? So these are the people that are just trying to eke it out to retirement, or maybe they should quit and find another job, but they don't want to, and they're just really low on beans. Super cynical, probably really hard to be around, and probably a fairly devastating field of relationships around them, right? So marriages fall apart, we're disconnected from kids and friends and family. Some of that is because we've turned into a tiny bean jar and we just don't have much left to give. Okay? If you are a tiny bean jar, it's okay. That's not hopeless. I know about compassion fatigue because I was a tiny bean jar. Okay? I didn't get the help I needed. I was a tiny bean jar, and part of that's why I went back to grad school, learned everything I did, and why I now run the business the way I do. I don't want all my lovely guardians that start out wanting to serve your communities to all turn into tiny bean jars. Okay? That's not what we want to do. And like I said, this isn't hopeless. This isn't a guaranteed path, bean jar path, right? But it does take some work. What I prefer is, especially if you're still early in your career, take care of it now. Watch the other trainings. Go see a culturally competent clinician who understands this idea of compassion fatigue. Come see me, right? Whatever you need to do. Because what you want to do is you want to build your skills for putting the beans back, build your skills for keeping your relationships strong, and build that relationship with a clinician early on. Okay? Guardian careers are hard. I would much rather, if you have a really hard season, maybe work is hard, or maybe you just had a new baby and marriage is hard, all that stuff is real life. And you can go back and talk to somebody you already know, somebody who's already helped you, rather than waiting until you're 20 years in and you're a tiny bean jar. And that just makes it a lot harder to really dig in and do the work. We can still do it, right? I kind of like tiny bean jars. Y'all are grumpy, which makes my job a little bit trickier, and there's a bit of a challenge that I like. So if you're a tiny bean jar, come in, let's talk about it. But I also would rather you don't get here, because this is a lonely, disconnected place. I would far rather we keep you healthier, okay? So that's it. Compassion fatigue is the cost of providing compassion and empathy to others. If you're a guardian, you're using huge levels of beans in order to do your daily work. This can make it hard to go home and be connected. This can wear you down if you're feeling really burnt out. And if you say things like, I just hate people over and over, that's a good signal that maybe you're low on beans. It is preventable, it is fixable, but it's not just going to happen magically, okay? So go watch the other trainings, call me or another clinician, take some steps to take good care of yourself because you're worth it. Thank you. I really appreciate the work that you do, and I'll see you later.